Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to be starting in verse 17 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we begin here in verse 17, verses 17 to 21 we're looking at living a holy life. Paul here explains about how the Christian should live a holy life. Now, as we begin that segment, verses 17 to 22 of chapter 4 is put off the old man. Putting off the old man. That begins living a holy life unto God. So let's start reading verse 17. And it says here, This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you from now on walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. Now, to put off the old self means to walk in a completely different direction than the world walks. This is what he's talking about here. So he says here in verse 17, This I say therefore, and what? And testify in the Lord. Now, the Greek word for testify means a solemn appeal or a declaration. Paul is saying that what he is about to say is as if the Lord Jesus himself were standing right there with him saying it. Paul tells them that from now on, they are not to live their lives as the other Gentiles or unbelievers do. As Christians, we are to come what? We are to come out from among them and be separate from the world. We are to be in the world, but our life is to no more draw its life and purpose and happiness from this world. Too many Christians have strong attachments to the things of this world. They got strong emotional attachments to something in this world, their car, a boat, a motorcycle, a house, their job, a person, whatever it is. Some Christians have strong attachments to these things, and it hinders their walk with God. So he says that I testify in the Lord. Then he says that you henceforth, or that what Paul means is right now, that you from now on, from this time, from this point in your life on. And then he says here that from henceforth you walk not as other Gentiles walk. Where? In the vanity of their mind. Now, vanity here is speaking about the aimlessness and the futility and the restlessness of their minds. The unsaved world lives in a state of illusion which sees pleasure in sin without the thought of punishment. All pursuits that exclude God are empty. They are worthless pursuits. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is all about the vanity of life without God. No matter how much money or possessions a person may attain in this life, or even contentment, they may be satisfied with not a lot of things. They have a house, they have a job, they have a car, they have a cat or a dog, whatever, and they're content. But without these, if a person attains these things without God, being the focal point of their life, it's all vanity. It's all worthless. It achieves nothing for their eternal future. It achieves nothing for their eternal future. Only one life, and it will be past. Only what's done with Christ will last. Now in verse 18, it says, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their hearts. Now, he says here, having the understanding darkened. Now, the Greek word for darkened is skotio, and it's in the perfect tense, and it means to make the mind blind or to darken the mind. Now, the perfect tense means that the blinding of the mind is a finished work already, and it continues to be blind permanently. Now let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And it says here, Paul says to the Corinthians, but if our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world, Satan himself, what has he done? He has blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. So now we know where the darkness is coming from Satan's kingdom. He's blinding the minds. Now, so he says, having the understanding darkened. Now, not only is their mind filled with aimlessness and futility, but their understanding is now darkened. Why is it darkened? Because they are against the Bible, and to be against the will of God for their life. What does it do? It suppresses intelligence and it promotes ignorance. Now, Paul goes on to say that the reason why the Gentiles are estranged from God is because of ignorance that is within themselves. Their alienation is not from some outside source, but the alienation comes from within them. And the reason why the Gentiles were ignorant of the things of God is because their hearts were hardened. They hardened their hearts toward God, which then caused ignorance of the things of God, which then resulted in being alienated from the life of God. Let me say that again. They hardened their hearts towards God, like we all did before we were saved. We didn't want anything to do with God. They hardened their hearts towards God, which then caused an ignorance of the things of God, which then resulted in being alienated from the life of God. Now, let's read John chapter 1. John chapter 1, verses 4 through 9. And it says here, because we're talking about darkness here. So John 1, verses 4 through 9 says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. Now there was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness to bear witness of that light, that all men through him might believe. Now he was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lights every man that comes into the world. Now, let's read chapter 3, verses 19 to 21. We're talking about light and darkness here. Chapter 3, verses 19 to 21 says, "And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world." That means Jesus Christ. "And men loved darkness rather than light." Why? Because their deeds were evil. Verse 20, "For everyone that does evil, well, they hate the light, neither do they come to the light." Why? "Lest their deeds be reproved." They don't want their deeds being reproved by the light, by the gospel. Verse 21, "But he that does come to the light, he that does truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God." Now, let's read verse 19. And it says, we're going to finish this lesson in verse 19. And it says, "Who, being past feeling, have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness." Now, in verses 17 and 18, they deal with the corrupt heart of the Gentiles. But in verse 19, it gives the outward expression of that corrupt heart. So in verses 17 and 18, it's saying that the unsaved Gentiles, they have a corrupt heart. And in verse 19, it deals with how the unsaved heart is expressed. So he says here in verse 19, "Who being past feeling," and this Greek word is apologeo, and it means to cease from pain, to cease to feel pain. An example is if you work hard with your hands and you get a callus on your hands. This Greek word is in the perfect tense, meaning that their hearts became hard and insensitive at some time in the past, and their hearts, they continue to be hard and insensitive, continuing on into the future. Their heart is not feeling anything that comes from their conscience. They are insensitive to the sin and to the corruption that is around them, and may even partake of that sin and corruption. Now, if you notice the unsaved people who are around you at work, at school, at home, if you go shopping, if you notice the unsaved people around you, you will see that they are at different levels of being past feeling, different levels of numbness. The sins that are shown on TV don't seem to bother them anymore. The sins that they hear on the radio, the sins that they see on their computer, they don't seem to bother them anymore. Now, so he says here in verse 19, "Who being past feeling," what? "Have given themselves over." Now, the Greek word here means to betray, or to hand over to another, or to give oneself up to someone. These deceivers with darkened minds have willingly given themselves over to a lifestyle without any restraints. Now, they've given themselves over to lasciviousness. Now, the Greek word for lasciviousness means a lawless life, or a life that lives against restraints. They don't want boundaries. They don't want laws telling them what they can and can't do. Remember, they are past feeling, meaning that they don't feel anything of conviction coming from their conscience. So when they sin or when they do something wrong, their conscience is telling them it's wrong, but they're not receiving the signal because they're past feeling. Their hearts are hard. Therefore, they give themselves over to whatever propensity their sinful nature desires. whether it's drugs or murder or pornography or gambling or lying or backbiting or gossiping, whatever it is, and they go wholeheartedly into that thing. Because why? Because they are without any conviction that it's wrong. Their hearts are trying to convict them and they're not receiving it. Their hearts are so hard that they can't hear the conviction coming from their own conscience. And then he says in verse 19, to work all uncleanness with greediness. Now, the reason why they have given themselves up to their lusts is so that they can be at the business of uncleanness. That's what the Greek is talking about here. What the Greek word used is meaning, it says to work. When the Greek word for work means to be in a business, to have a job. It means any kind of moral uncleanness or fleshly impurity. And they do it with greediness. Now, greediness here is not meaning their desire to make money from their lusts. But the word greediness here describes a greediness to continue to do their lust more and more. They can't wait to fulfill their lust again and again. That's the greediness. Again, when you read the word greediness, it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the desire to do that sin, that unclean thing over and over again. Now, verses 17 to 19 describe the utter darkness and the depravity that people have arrived at. Yet we were all like this to some degree. Listen, I know that reading verses 17 to 19 is describing the darkness of an unsaved person's heart. But before we were saved, our hearts were that dark also. But yet we were all like this. We were all like that. To some degree, we had this same heart within us. If the picture of this depraved person seems horrible, then think about the dark, sinful pit that you were saved out of. Listen, every one of us was all in the same boat. We really were. We were all floating on the same boat of depravity and darkness and deepness, without any hope. And yet the Lord rescued us. All right, we're going to continue on in verse 20 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.